What I found in beginning to understand how the pharmaceutical system works is that access is not necessarily baked in. That is not because anybody is a malign actor in this. It simply is not part of what the pharmaceutical industry can do by itself. And it needs partnership, realizing that maternal health is radically underserved, not only for populations in low and middle income countries, but frankly, for all of us.
Is women leadership still heavily underrepresented? And should we be expanding on that in order to address women's healthcare?
In the pharmaceutical industry, as in all major industries, women's leadership is vastly underrepresented in terms of C-suite and the levels below.
Welcome to another episode of the Health Equity Podcast. This is a series where we bring together healthcare leaders who've been working on healthcare issues and bridging gaps in health access and bringing more equitable access to patients living all over the world. My name is Iyer, and I lead the Access to Medicine Foundation. In today's episode, we're going to be tackling a number of different issues affecting women's health. And this is part of the Health Equity Through Her Lens campaign. In this campaign, we're looking specifically at women's health needs, unpacking some of the major challenges, and talking through solutions that are really solving this reality. Today's guest is Andrea Lucard, who's had decades of experience working on innovation and access, and working directly with the pharmaceutical industry on bridging some of these gaps. Welcome, Andrea, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jay. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Andrea, you've had a remarkable career ranging from the Medicines for Malaria Venture to various different leadership positions and boards in organizations that are really driving healthcare for women, like the Concept Foundation. You're a member of the Women in Global Health chapter in Switzerland, and other areas. What can you tell me a little bit about what drives your commitment to access, and why is it so pivotal right now to focus on women and girls' healthcare?
Yes, it's been almost 2 decades now that I've been in this area. And I got involved originally because I was really interested as a non-scientist in the science side of things. It was really quite fascinating to be engaged with drug development and to be working with various organizations, and particularly with MMV, where I was for almost 15 years. What I found in beginning to understand how the pharmaceutical system works is that access is not necessarily baked in. That is not because anybody is a malign actor in this. It simply is not part of what the pharmaceutical industry can do by itself. And it needs partnership, and it needs people to be thinking about access to medicines of all sorts. So as I moved specifically just from product development and really the R&D and pharmaceutical side, I became more and more interested in the access and the social science side of the access as well to medicines. So I serve on the board of the International Center for Diarrheal and Disease Research in Bangladesh. And there it's a combination of basic science along with social science, and in particular, some very, very interesting work in women, reproductive health, the maternal microbiome, in a southern setting with a premier southern research institution. That led me further into working, for example, in reproductive health and product development in reproductive health. So I'm on the board of the Concept Foundation, which is a product development partnership, and based in Thailand and in Switzerland, that does sexual reproductive health. That led me into maternal health, realizing that maternal health is radically underserved, not only for populations in low and middle income countries, but frankly, for all of us. There are very few products that have been developed or designed for pregnant women and pregnancy at all, which has also led me then to working with other organizations like the Women's Brain Foundation, working in neurological health, and Esperar, which is doing maternal health and rare disease. They're all connected one another, and they're all connected through a very similar thread, which is the choices and the science that we have chosen to do has not necessarily reflected the populations that we need to serve.
So how can you actually improve that science, right? I mean, is it just the awareness that you need to increase? among different organizations and people to realize that there is a fundamental gap in the science and in eventual access? Or do you need to really redevelop technical changes in the science itself?
It's a great question. You have to start with the first, right? You have to understand that just like in pediatrics, children are not small adults. In sex and gender, but let's say in sex and health, women are not small men. And for a very long time, really until, let's say, the last 5 years, there was just an assumption that if you were talking about cardiovascular health, there was no sex or gender difference in cardiovascular health. And so medicines that were good for men, statins, for example, would work in women. And therefore, the ways that we asked the questions, designed the clinical plans, et cetera, could just continue to assume that this was all. You just had male volunteers, you had male cell lines in animals, you had male animals, you had male patients, and it was all going to be fine. Those were bad assumptions, but that's what science is for, right? Science, amongst the things, is to ask the question, can keep asking the question. And those questions are now being resolved to a certain degree to say, indeed, you can't just make that assumption. So start there and recognize that those assumptions are poor. From there, yes, you have to start changing systems to a substantial degree, but you don't have to change them all at once in order to make real change.
So we know that gender gaps in research and development have led to health outcomes that don't fully address the need that women uniquely face. Can you expand on that a little bit more and tell a little bit more about the other specific needs that can be addressed by research and development?
Yeah. So the ways that people speak about this now, or increasingly speaking about the needs of women, are those diseases that only, or conditions that only affect women, those conditions that predominantly affect women, and those conditions that affect women differently than men, females differently than males. If you take the first, you're really talking largely about those diseases and conditions that are what have been in the formerly called bikini medicine, right? Everything from here to here, right? And that can be about our reproductive health. Often it is about our reproductive health. It can be women-specific cancers. It can be other things. In that area, there's a radical underserved population, and that is within pregnancy. And I'm happy we can talk a little bit later if you wish about the really significant concerns about pregnancy and R&D. So a very underserved population for medical conditions are conditions specific to pregnancy. Then secondly, those areas that predominantly affect women, and those can be areas, for example, a neurological disease like Alzheimer's, in which the patient population in women is much greater, and the Women's Brain Foundation is doing quite a lot of work in this and understanding. And then the third area that is affecting women differently. So cardiovascular is one of them. Inflammatory disease can be in either category 2 or in this category, pain and so forth. In all of those areas, we have a real dearth of research for women, whether it is new product development in maternal health, in which there have been virtually no medicines developed at all. Shocking, given how many women are pregnant and how desperate the situation is in some cases in things like preeclampsia, postpartum hemorrhage, and so forth. In those areas in which, like Alzheimer's or in inflammatory diseases, lupus and others, where we have not done adequate clinical trial research in women, and then again in cardiovascular and other areas. All of those areas are significantly underserved. And there's increasingly good data out there about this. So, for example, just recently, the MHRA in the UK did a survey to find out that women-only diseases or women-only clinical trials versus men-only clinical trials were only about 30% of the number of men-only clinical trials, right? Which is, it's not like we have only 30% of male-only diseases in all of this. One of the other significant areas that has happened over time is that even when we're looking at women in clinical trials, so again, this MHRA evaluation, some 90% of clinical trials have women in them. Terrific. We're all done, right? Except that we have very few sex disaggregated data sets. So taking an average really doesn't help us very much. So across the entire spectrum of women's health, we're currently underserved.
And do you think that there should be more regulation that incentivizes or changes the status quo in terms of usage of this data in clinical research, in product development, and in eventual access? Or do you think that this should be just solved because the dearth of data is actually available in front of us, and we should just get down to doing it?
It's a great question, and I think there's some good debate in this arena. So I was just serving for the World Economic Forum on a white paper that's come out recently, and I'll find the reference for you on that, that does bring forward a set of recommendations on how to deal with some of these issues. And one of the recommendations is the evaluation of a maternal investigation plan, similar to the pediatric investigation plan that came forward in the early part of the 21st century. It is clear that the pediatric investigation plan that was put in place has made a huge difference in pediatrics, right? And there's in the United States, at least, there's a carrot and a stick that's associated with it, right? But the stick was fairly substantial to say you need to actually prove to us why children shouldn't be involved, as opposed to the other way around, why should they be involved, right? And so this is it, and it has made a difference. And there's at least another reference I can find for you that actually looks at the number of products that have moved forward because of this. So there is some call from people experienced in this arena to have what amounts to a maternal investigation plan, which looks at pregnancy, and pregnancy being a very specific moment in some women's reproductive lives, but that is one of the major barriers for us to be able to get women into clinical trials. A good example of a current situation that is quite shocking, I think, is that the new GLP-1 inhibitors that have come through that are now being used massively for diabetes and obesity have a label that indicate that women should not use this during pregnancy, and particularly during first trimester pregnancy. Now, as we all understand, most women do not know that they're pregnant in the first 4 to 6 to 8, even 12 weeks that they're pregnant. So they're taking a GLP-1 inhibitor for their health, and they are now supposed to not be taking this in pregnancy. This is not a reasonable way to develop a medicine that is being used across a very large swath of the population. Now, it does appear in the GLP-1s that we're probably relatively safe, but we've passed that broadly societal have passed that risk from the clinical trial work into the general population. You get to take the GLP-1 up until the point that you're pregnant, and then you find out whether or not there's teratogenicity associated with this product. It's unacceptable. Are we going to wait for the industry and for the clinical trial researchers and so forth to do this themselves? I would love to. I would love to believe that is effective. I would rather not have more legislation, but it's unlikely that the change will come at the speed it needs to come without legislation of some sort.
So in the Access to Medicine Foundation's research reports, we've identified that not a lot of clinical studies is actually being conducted in low and middle income countries. In fact, there are hotspots around, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, but not enough across most of the low and middle income countries. So inclusion of clinical studies in low and middle countries is a major issue. And on top of that, we're basically saying we need women included in these studies. We need to understand whether these studies can build in a system for looking at pregnancy and lactating women in these studies itself. Are you seeing a lot of interest in low and middle income countries in addressing this issue and really finding a way to regulate clinical studies and eventual access for women?
Yes, in fact, I think the interest in low and middle income countries may be greater than it is in more developed countries, um, and partly that I think that has to do with the burden of disease and the types of diseases, in fact, that people are still trying to deal with. Let me give an example. In malaria, malaria is a disease that kills predominantly children, and the group of people that are that die most frequently after children are pregnant women, largely pregnant women in their first pregnancies. So we're talking about, if we talk about an African context, we're actually talking about pregnant girls and adolescents. Right? So, um, and for a very long time, I think in malaria as well as other disease areas, we had the same kind of response that goes, it's too hard. It's too difficult to work in this field. The science is too hard. The regulatory work is too hard, and so forth. But MMV took on in 2018, decided that it was really going to take this on as a problem, because as a not-for-profit organization, it's designed to do good science for the most neglected. So it needs to work in this. So it began working on the Malaria in Mothers and Babies program, known as MIMBA, and it began working across the entire field of pregnancy. So first, in terms of taking a look at pregnancy registries, what happens if people are taking medicines for which there's no label for pregnancy, but they have to take antimalarials because they have malaria? Are there increased risk for the mother or for the fetus? And then it began moving backwards backwards and forwards actually in the product development life cycle, to say not just inadvertent exposure, but what happens if you start really developing medicines with pregnant women in mind. So the challenge in that is the ethical frameworks for managing this and the regulatory frameworks for managing this really aren't very well developed. So you have to work with regulators and with investigators to understand what this looks like. So what MMV did is to work with London School and a number of organizations to work with regulators in several African settings to begin saying, what does the risk benefit look like in terms of the ethical nature of including pregnant women in clinical trials? There's lots of ethical work that you have to take a look at. You have to be able to look at informed consent. You have to assume that you have enough information about a chemical entity to de-risk it substantially. And then you have to really be able to work on what is the number of people that you have in a clinical trial and so forth, a clinical trial design. But what we found, what MMV found in that process, is that there was a real hunger for working in this way, because pregnant women die of malaria in countries, and therefore the risk benefit of trying to figure this out is really quite substantial. So, working with regulators and working with ethicists, MMV then also teamed up with the Concept Foundation, which does sexual and reproductive health, maternal health, and has now, was recently a meeting of 11 African regulators and people with regulatory experience from EMA and from these two product development partnerships, to really look at how do regulators really want to work with this. In Uganda, for example, we know that they are looking at this very substantially and now have something similar to what might amount to a maternal investigation plan, but without being so specific, because the risk benefit in their country is so great. It actually kind of turns the paradigm on its head a little bit. I think for a long time, it's been the North that said, we're the ones who are particularly innovative and particularly strong and particularly in this. And actually, maybe not. Maybe it turns the other way around. And it could be, what I think I'm seeing at this point is that in the area of diseases of poverty and maternal health, it's really the not-for-profit product development partnerships that are pushing the way, and the regulators who are pushing with them, and the investigators. And there is an advocacy group of some 20 organizations working in tuberculosis, maternal health, malaria, HIV, who are coming together to take a look at this because they fully recognize that we cannot work with the health of populations unless we're looking at unless we're looking at maternal health.
I mean, you've mentioned that a lot of the change and activity around women's health is driven by public sector organizations and not-for-profit organizations, and in countries itself, responding to the needs and the demands that they see in countries. How are we gonna? What are the main incentives that we can talk about? And how should we get the pharmaceutical industry to be more on board? Because it seems like the partners are now there. The data is evolving and there's more data available. There's more of a demand for this to come in place. What does this mean for the pharmaceutical industry? Is there an existing incentive that they need to work with, or how do we get the pharmaceutical industry to actually act on more women's health issues?
Let me come at this a couple of different ways. Let's take a look at what's difficult and what's easy. So the easy thing the pharmaceutical industry can do right now is simply sex disaggregate its data. That's it. That is not you're conducting clinical trials already. To sex disaggregate the data is a very useful piece of information to have. It is possible that what will happen in that is that you will find that certain populations are not going to be served by your product, but you may also find that other populations are. So, for example, in Alzheimer's, really the most recent products are not ones that are particularly useful for women, but in averaging it out, it means that they're more useful for men. So you do have a good product if you have sex disaggregated your data. Move forward on that. The second area, I think, is to think differently about what does a market look like. And this is probably one of the areas where a lack of women's leadership in the pharmaceutical industry has probably hampered the industry from really understanding what markets can look like. You can hear now in the last 2 or 3 years, quite a lot of buzz, particularly in biotech, about, for example, women's hormonal health in menopause. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's not like that's a new industry. It's not like women are only just now experiencing menopause, right? It's not in the last 5 years. But it's been in the last 5 years that women have grown into menopause while they are in relative positions of investment as investors or in the biopharmaceutical industry. So a second area that the pharma industry can really do is take a better look at markets and decide genuinely, are these markets, are they really not as poor as they've considered until now, and allow that to be part of their general marketing. A third area that is somewhat more challenging, but in fact, I think will have a much greater value for the pharmaceutical industry moving further down the pike, is to really start understanding more around the science of drug development and what does the science of drug development look like when you start looking at different sexes. There is no doubt that understanding the biology of women and drugs is extremely complicated. It's complicated because we have different fat distribution, and therefore the lipid profile of your drug may be different. It's more complicated because in fetal development, 2 X chromosomes, one of them is suppressed and may from the father or for the mother, and it may be distributed differently across the system, and that may change protein bindings. It may be more complicated because of different hormonal cycles, no question. But we're now in an era of massive computing power. We are now in an era where we can ask those questions and start at least coming up with good hypotheses. So for the pharmaceutical industry, as you start thinking about personalized medicine, this is almost a no-brainer. The investment is not going to be so massive. So those are the areas where you can really start saying along the way, how are we going to think about population health, markets, and who's going to get served?
So you've just mentioned that women as they take on more leadership positions in the industry and in investments, there can also be a lot more drive from the top in addressing women's healthcare in these industries. What are you seeing in terms of policies and programs that are really being shaped by women leaders? Is women leadership still heavily underrepresented? Or and should we be expanding on that in order to address women's healthcare?
In the pharmaceutical industry, as in all major industries, women's leadership is vastly underrepresented in terms of C-suite and the levels below. And that's across the board, whether it's the pharma industry, it's the tech industry, and so forth. Does that matter? Well, in a perfect world, it wouldn't really matter. Everyone would be asking really good questions, and we would have really good answers. And yet we know that is not the case, right? We can see this undoubtedly correlation between the number and strength of women's leadership at all levels. So I would say not just at the C-suite, but I would also say in the investor class, those people who are actually making investments, in the biotech, in areas in which women are running biotech companies or getting investments. And so indeed, we need representation just to be asking good questions. And this partly lived experience, and it's also partly just diversity in science leads to good questions, and good questions lead to good science. So we need it. If I can give an example again in the global health field, in about 2018, I'm going to make the reference. The report began being developed called Global Health 50/50, which came out of the UK. Global Health 50/50 essentially put a spotlight up or a mirror up against the global health industry, to not so much the pharma industry, and just looked at a number of indicators as to whether or not women at the time were well represented, either in the boards, in leadership, and then to some degree in the research done itself by these organizations. And in 2018, we looked pretty abysmal as an industry. Even though we're in the not-for-profit, we're full of women, yeah, but not necessarily full of women on our boards, not necessarily full of women in the C-suites, and so forth. And that report, similar to the Access Medicines Index, right, actually is a very powerful tool to tell us what it is that we're doing. And at MMV, to the credit of MMV, we took that very seriously. And it was really out of the Global Health 50/50 that this MIMBA project that I'm describing came to reality, because we as women leaders inside the organization said, okay, we have to take this, we have to go now. We can't just sort of sit behind. This is important for all of us in terms of being able to now, representation, however, is insufficient by itself. You could have all women in the C-suite, but if you're not prepared to actually ask these kinds of questions and do the research and take the risks, you're still not going to get further. So it's a good step, but it's not the only step that you have to take.
And women make up a vast majority of the healthcare workforce globally. Yet, I think in many countries around the world, you don't necessarily have equal pay or adequate levels of training in order for women to further their careers or be able to serve the communities that they serve with healthcare. How can the pharmaceutical industry play a role in changing that?
Yeah, this is a substantial part of the work of Women in Global Health, which is a global organization now with chapters in, I think, 65 countries. Started originally out of the United States and now really broad. And amongst the things that they're discussing is not just training and pay, but literally security, right? How many women are in healthcare positions in which they are harassed or assaulted as women? So let's say there's a couple of things to take a look at from the pharmaceutical side. The first one is, again, awareness. For a long time, particularly in global health, I think both global health and industry were just prepared to say that healthcare workforce is just women's work. Just like, taking care of elderly people and teaching people, and that's all women's work. And women's work is largely historically uncompensated, and it's better if it's uncompensated, or if it's maybe partially compensated. But all of the decision making is going to be made at higher levels, and health will still be delivered. Well, look how well that's working. It's not a way, as we all understand, it's not the way you would run your business. It's therefore not the way you would run your health workforce, so forth. So the pharmaceutical industry as an industry in general needs to be taking this seriously. You have great talent from all the way from the local village health workers all the way through the ministries of health, education, welfare. And finding that talent, promoting that talent, and paying that talent is the same whether you're working in developing countries or low and middle income countries, and high income countries. Do not take people for granted, and you get better work out of them. Right? Let's start there. And then I think the other part is to really build in training and equity when you start doing work such as running clinical trials in low and middle income countries. You want to develop the kind of health workforce that is going to be sustainable for you, your clinical trials, the products you're going to be distributing. All of that also includes women, and oftentimes, more importantly, women who will actually stay in their communities and continue to work. So the pharmaceutical industry does have an important role to play. Like with a lot of industries, the pharma has benefited from much of the not-for-profit infrastructure that has been put in place over time. As that infrastructure starts to, I was going to say disintegrate, but it's not disintegrating. It is reforming itself, right? As donors start moving out, as the landscape starts to shift, industry needs to understand that it has been a beneficiary of a lot of this aid as well, and now needs to start thinking about what that has brought in financial and structural terms to them, and begin supporting it themselves.
You've mentioned a bit about how the pharmaceutical industry needs to look out for how health workers are being empowered to in a fair and appropriate way deliver on access needs. How can this be actually put in reality? Does it mean that when the pharmaceutical industry works in partnership with an organization, this should be built into partnership contracts? Does it mean that they need to have policies and practices really at the top of the company that is embedded in terms of, we want to make sure that any women healthcare worker really gets equal rights, equal pay, equal treatment, really at the top of the organization? Because we're sitting in an era where the pharmaceutical industry does make commitments, and the commitments are really embedding a particular philosophy across an entire company. So how does this work in reality when you think about how the industry works in partnerships?
Yeah, it's a great and it's a complex question. Far be it from me to tell either the industry or their partners how they should be operating their business. I do believe that a commitment to, let's just call it a commitment to sustainability, and the business sustainability is the first place to start. And business sustainability includes the sustainability of the workforce. And that's true, again, in any industry where you're working. It's true in Bangladesh in the garment industry, and it's true in Brazil in the agricultural industry. So start there. And don't think about it as an add-on. Think about it as a proper corporate strategy. And you have a strategy that says sustainability includes workforce in these countries. Now, what does that look like country by country or region by region? That becomes more challenging, right? You absolutely have countries and regions in which the functional rights of women workers are guaranteed by all kinds of things, whether or not women are married or whether they live far from home and those kinds of things. So At that point, the place to really start thinking and working is with the civil society groups that are in the countries who can understand those things and navigate well. Civil society, like Women in Global Health, for example, has a great deal of information about how you navigate these issues inside a country, how you navigate it with the government, how you navigate it with the local population. And so the ability to manage those partnerships with ease and with comfort and with openness will be the degree to which the pharmaceutical companies can operate in individual contexts. It's a really exciting problem, right? It's a place where it's a different way of thinking about sustainability. And in an era in which there's been attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, and we shouldn't go there, you don't have to go anywhere near those words. You just have to go and say, who's going to be delivering your diagnostics platform? How are you going to make sure that they're trained? How are you going to make sure that they're compensated? And how are you going to make sure that next time you come through with another diagnostics platform or another clinical trial, they're still there. They're still trained. You don't have to start all over again. I'll give a great example right now that the Concept Foundation is working in preeclampsia through quite a number, I think maybe I'm going to get the number wrong, but a number of sub-Saharan African countries, and I was beginning probably to work elsewhere as well. And they have tens of thousands of women who are currently enrolled in this preeclampsia trial. This requires training of midwives and healthcare workers to be sure that they can do gestational age evaluation of all of these women who are there. You don't want to retrain all of the midwives on doing gestational age because someone over here has decided that they're inadequately paid, right? You just don't, just like you don't do it in your developed countries. So making that part of your overall platform plan is fundamental.
So going back to the point on pregnancy or safe management of pregnancy globally, what are some of the major issues that you feel are not very well represented or researched, and what are some of the key products that you think should be in the R&D pipelines of the pharmaceutical industry and their partners in order to serve women better?
Well, let me talk about how risk has been categorized until now, and some of the ways that not just the pharmaceutical industry, but also the biotech and so forth have looked at products. The first place where conversation and partnership and co-development really needs to work is in the concept of risk associated with pharmaceutical development in pregnancy. As I referenced slightly earlier, the way that we've managed products for pregnancy at this point has been to decide that the industry doesn't take any risk on this, and that the woman and her provider take all of the risk. So the number of pharmaceutical products that are used off-label for women who are pregnant is enormous, and I think I'll need to find some references for you on the percentages of this. So what that means is that in all areas where you are pregnant and almost all areas in which you're pregnant and have to continue to take a medicine or take a medicine for some reason, you're essentially working off-label. Now, this is similar to what's happened in pediatrics as well. And you're working in a data-free zone. Now, it's not entirely data-free. One of the things that I've learned by being with the Concept Foundation is that obstetricians and gynecologists globally share an awful lot of information with one another. So when they reach out to one another and say, is it safe to use XYZ pain medication in pregnancy? There will be people who say, yes, I've been using this effectively, but this is not real data, right? This is not actually how we assume this should be working. So even in chronic disease, in all areas of chronic disease, you need to take a look at what drugs are likely to be taken in in medicine and decide where are those areas in which we can properly and ought to have categorized the risk associated with pregnancy. There was an interesting article, interesting paper that came out in 2024 from the National Academies of Science in the United States around the risk benefit and whether or not pharmaceutical companies were more likely to be sued if there were issues in clinical trials. And indeed, in fact, what they found was that there are very few instances in which that's likely the case, but the teratogenicity of products that women might have been exposed to in pregnancy does actually lead to lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. So categorizing that risk and being real about it and not just waving our hands. There's a lot of hand waving around this. It's too expensive. It's going to be too hard. Don't wave your hands. Just come at the data and start looking at this and begin looking at the questions also around how do you do the development of good clinical trials for pregnancy with regulators and with insurance companies, right? And when you're looking at trials insurance and so forth. So that's one important area to categorize. So then becomes the question of, if you're looking, first of all, in pregnancy, what are the products? Almost anything that we use, right, in our normal lives. But there's some areas that you can look at and say, there are few good categorizations of this, and there's a decently sized population. There's some areas, for example, in epilepsy. Pain is another one. Pain management and pregnancy are areas that are substantially underserved and need to be taken a look at. Depression is another one. Postpartum maternal depression is a very serious disease, very serious condition, causes loss of life in both fetus, baby, mothers, and needs to be further developed. And then in those areas in which breastfeeding is also, it's not that difficult actually. The work in lactation is fairly well developed at this point. All of those areas need serving. So the other place where you really can say that there is a substantial difference, but underserved populations in women seem to be where the research is coming forward. Neurological disease, inflammatory disease, cardiovascular disease are all areas that have huge populations for which we have poorly categorized or, in fact, poorly served populations.
And for a number of years, the Access to Medicine Index has identified a range of different priorities that women's health priorities that actually have seen very few pharmaceutical companies have been working on these issues itself. So, and in the past few years, we also noticed that a lot of pharma companies have actually left women's health, traditional women's health in terms of contraceptive care, pregnancy care. Isn't this a worrying sign?
Yes. And the back and forth on this as to what, is there a market? Is there not a market? Where are we going to move? Where are we not going to move? It is a worrying sign. And indeed, there's more recent, there's also, again, this MHRA and US pictures is quite important. Whether or not, what is it going to take to move? I guess perhaps the embedded question in this is, what is it going to take to move it forward? And I think we circle back to, what does it take to decide that there's a market, and what does it take for us to decide it's important? Let's go back to the point about a maternal investigation plan, right? If you begin actually studying health and pregnancy, you begin studying health in women. Right, you actually end up starting to you actually start looking at the places that have been an enormous bottleneck and blockage in that arena. So I would say that that's a very important place to start. And those people who are really advocating for a maternal investigation plan are doing it in large part to make sure, not just for maternal health, but that it's simply part of R&D.
And in that way, bring back the industry to prioritize.
You sort of essentially have to, right, at that point, at least have data. The second one could be, again, in the area of just saying, you need to have women in your clinical trials, and now you need to sex disaggregate the data. As soon as you start properly sex disaggregating the data, you start to see whether or not products are appropriate for women and appropriate for men. And so I think that's another area of great importance. There's a bit of a threat that's associated with this as well. And I think that this, as the climate has been shifting and as research has been changing on this, there are some safety questions that are going to start coming up. Drugs in large scale in populations in which there may be adverse events or severe adverse events that may be sex related that will now be able to be uncovered, because they weren't uncoverable before. It was too difficult. I was just at the World Economic Forum last week and hearing a speaker say, look, for too long we've said that the increase or the larger number of adverse events in women has for too long been shrugged off as a question of polypharmacy or women or women's health-seeking behaviors, or we've just said we can't really solve that. But we can solve it now because we have big data. We're really in an era in which we are no longer asking some poor graduate student in the bowels of some university to comb through by hand severe adverse events responses in health systems and begin to try to make that track.
You can mine data.
You can start mining data, and while I have not yet seen large-scale data mining on this, allow me to tell you, I think it's no more than, let's say 18 months away, 24 months away before someone goes, oh yeah, we need to do this. And we have, as they used to say, we have the technology.
In healthcare, there is an assumption that we have all the tools available for safe pregnancy because it's available in high-income countries. So it's a question of access. We just need to bring these tools to low and middle income countries. A lot of attention in global health has been on oxytocin for postpartum hemorrhaging. A lot of issues that you just spoke about in terms of the full needs of a woman to ensure that there's a safe pregnancy or safe management of pregnancy is often not even discussed in healthcare, let alone in global health. Shouldn't we be responsible for changing that so that the pharmaceutical industry has a very clear result that they need to work on? Great
question and very nuanced. But let's start, in fact, with a question about oxytocin. Oxytocin's very, very important tool, but so is TXA. And TXA is developed and is having a very hard time getting accessed for all of the reasons that we well understand in global health. Right? We don't have policy. We may not have supply chain, we don't have training, all of those sorts of things. So that's a very good example of where, indeed, we have useful, important tools, and they're developed, and yet they're not fully effectively used. And this is the work of, let's say, not just the pharmaceutical industry, but all of us, right? So this is the very important role that the not-for-profit PDP and other and the let's say the researchers and clinical trialists actually serve. There is no reason TXA should not be available in the places that it can be used. But let's talk also about the assumptions of what is really available and whether or not innovation is sufficient. So I was having a conversation not long ago with a very well-respected researcher, not in the maternal health field, but it was about preeclampsia and whether or not there needed to be new products for preeclampsia. And this researcher simply said, we have low-dose aspirin, that's sufficient. It was actually a shocking moment for me, right? And it was a shocking moment because that's like saying in malaria, that's like saying, well, yeah, we have products that were developed in the 1950s. They're perfectly acceptable. Everyone can just use chloroquine. They're effective. Just go ahead and use it. No, seriously, no. Just what we know in preeclampsia, yes, low-dose aspirin can be very important. But it is not necessarily effective, for example, in early onset preeclampsia. So these are areas where some of the organizations I'm working with are looking at the R&D side of preeclampsia. Now, why is that important? Not just in developing countries, because it turns out that those medicines are also not available here in the Netherlands or in the United States. in places where preeclampsia is a very, very serious condition. It's a global issue. And the ability of us to be able to say, yes, we're doing real R&D on important products that are going to save the lives of pregnant mothers and their babies, and their fetuses and their children, and have an impact on their families. It is not okay at this point to say, products are all done. Look, there's one. It's been around since, the Chichona bark was, it's like, no, we can't do that. So this is, again, the place where I think the partnership side of this work is really important. If I can talk about pediatrics for a second, and one of the kinds of partnerships that have been incredibly important in pediatrics, again, I'll go back to malaria. MMV had a partnership with Novartis very early on to develop a pediatric formulation of Coartem, which is used broadly for treatment of uncomplicated malaria. And MMV got involved with Novartis because there was no pediatric formulation, and pediatric formulations are crucially important for pediatric populations. But it was difficult for Novartis to be able to take the financial and research risk associated with developing the pediatric formulation. So that partnership delivered on an innovation that this last month has just now celebrated 500 million treatments that have come worldwide, right? 500 million treatments, right, for a very vulnerable population globally. Even more interesting, what has now happened is that Novartis got engaged and very interested in doing with MMV in taking a look at an entirely new formulation, which required new science on a pediatric population less than 5 kilos. It required an entirely new formulation of the product because the metabolism of the two products that are in Coartem is very different under 5 kilos. Now, this is a very small population, right? But Novartis took the risk along with MMV, along with this kind of support to make this work. This is the kind of innovation that we need in women's health. Extra risk and do this. And recognize that there is a way that this not only brings good science, it brings public health, it brings good partnership. It's fully acceptable that it is, and it's fully understandable, at least, that it's difficult for the pharma industry to do much of this by themselves. But it's not fully understandable that the partnership mechanisms are not being fully used in order to solve these problems.
Yet a lot of partnership mechanisms are heavily funded by donors, right? And, that's not always very sustainable when you think about all the solutions. I mean, should we be scrambling now to form as many partnerships as possible while the donor environment is still there? Or is there another mechanism that we need to use so that companies see this as a risk they're willing to take, or there are other organizations that are willing to absorb that risk?
Again, I'll go back. Well, I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is the kind of traditional donor landscape. How are you taking a look at traditional donors, bilateral funders, the major global health funders, and so forth, and is there enough focus in those areas to really be talking about women's health? I think the answer is it's still just developing, right? This is an area that has not had the same amount of focus as either infectious disease or in reproductive health. And so there does need to be donor focus in this arena, traditional donors. There's another way to think about this in terms of non-traditional donors or non-traditional investors. And that one's a little bit less well characterized now, but I think, again, it falls into the biotech and where there is investment in biotech. But preeclampsia, let's just go there. A proper product for preeclampsia is not only a low and middle income country question.
No, it's a global issue.
It's a global issue,
a global
and it's a global market, right? So thinking about it in terms of global markets becomes really really important. I think the third area where there has been perhaps insufficient attention may be in thinking of how the relationship between one product area and another can de-risk or increase the knowledge for one place for drug development. In an earlier question, you said, what is it that pharma can do? And I think one of these areas is that as we start learning and knowing and doing more in this arena, data sharing and understanding, characterizing the hormonal questions around drug development, characterizing the hormonal questions, not the hormonal questions, but the sex-specific questions in products, is something that we should begin thinking about as a global good. It's difficult to do that, right? Because if you're really, really good at doing this and you're a major pharma, you may want to just hold that. So now you have the corner on all things women's health. But if we can begin recognizing that this is a complex area, a complex scientific area, and yet we can make leaps and bounds, we could actually probably de-risk it and make the cost much, much better. It's a very optimistic way of looking at it. That's a very glass, really 2/3 full.
Yeah, but it's a motivating way of looking at it.
And there may be either companies or researchers or investors who would be prepared to think about this as a kind of platform that they would, even in a for-profit platform, but something with a more limited return, right? So those are three ways you can take a look at it. Traditional donors step up, non-traditional donors get involved, and the industry writ large. So I don't just mean pharma, I also mean researchers, I mean research organizations, I mean biotech and not-for-profit pharma. Let's figure out how to stop saying we just can't do this because it's too hard.
Andrea, you've had decades of experience working in issues surrounding women's health. And I really appreciate a lot of the insights you brought here. What is the one message you'd like to leave viewers, especially those in the pharmaceutical industry, with on how they can tackle women's health globally?
The responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry is to provide the products for the health of our populations, whether those are vaccines, diagnostics, mechanisms, drugs. And until now, we've assumed that the population is essentially homogeneous and that sex hasn't mattered. We know now sex does matter. And we can't turn back. We can't close our eyes and say, all of our clinical trials can now just be done in the same way. The outstanding author, Caroline Crialdo Perez, who wrote Invisible Women, who's a real leader in this area for a very long time, has been campaigning on this for many, many years. And what she was able to uncover years ago has now been brought forward again and again and again. We can't close our eyes. But we don't have to wring our hands. We have tools now. We have partnerships. We have regulators who wish to be involved in these kinds of conversations. We have mechanisms of working with the insurance industry. We have not just women leaders, but women leaders around the world who are engaged. We can characterize the markets. There's no reason not to get involved in this. And we don't have to wring our hands. We can. Yes, we can.
Well, thank you, Andrea, for sharing all your insights on how we can actually address women's health worldwide. It's a pleasure having you here.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the great questions and an opportunity to really spend some time with it.
Today, we've heard in the podcast about how women have very unique needs in healthcare. Women's health is a major priority globally. Reproductive health is one component of it. Another component is on how women actually react differently to different products. And some diseases affect women disproportionately. So there are many ways that women's health can be addressed by the pharmaceutical industry and should be addressed by the pharmaceutical industry. Billions of women around the world are waiting for the right treatments, the right management products to manage access to safe pregnancy, to safe, effective healthcare overall. And we can do something about this particular issue. In fact, we can even start realizing that this is a growth market. This is a market available for the pharmaceutical industry and the partners. Although at the same time, right now we are facing an issue where this issue has been left underrepresented, underinvested for such a long time. We need to step up on this issue, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to some of the solutions that Andrea has spoke about in today's podcast. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.